Imagine becoming a billionaire, then losing over $1.5 billion in just one day. One day, you're one of the richest musicians in history. Your sneaker brand is generating billions of dollars in sales, and the biggest companies in the world are fighting to work with you. Then, almost overnight, the partnerships disappear, your estimated net worth plummets, and the empire you've spent years building begins to crumble. That's exactly what happened to Kanye West, now known as Ye. In October 2022, Forbes estimated that his net worth dropped from around $2 billion to roughly $400 million after Adidas ended its partnership with Yeezy. But here's what's fascinating. Kanye didn't lose billions because someone emptied his bank account. He lost billions because one business deal had become the foundation of almost his entire fortune. This is the story of how one of the greatest celebrity business success stories turned into one of the biggest financial collapses in entertainment history. Long before Yeezy became a global brand, Kanye West was already changing the music industry. Born in Atlanta and raised in Chicago, Kanye first made his name as a producer. He created hit records for artists like Jay-Z before convincing the industry to take him seriously as a rapper. In 2004, his debut album The College Dropout became an instant success. Unlike many artists at the time, Kanye wasn't trying to fit into hip-hop's existing mold. He mixed soulful production with deeply personal lyrics, fashion influences, and bold opinions. Over the next decade, he became one of the most influential musicians in the world. Albums like Late Registration, Graduation, 808s, and Heartbreak, and My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy redefined modern hip-hop. But music was never his only ambition. Kanye wanted something bigger. He wanted to dominate fashion. Fashion, however, didn't welcome him with open arms. Despite his fame, many luxury brands didn't take him seriously. He repeatedly spoke about how difficult it was to break into the industry. One of his earliest collaborations came with Nike, resulting in the Air Yeezy sneakers. While the shoes generated enormous hype, Kanye became frustrated with the relationship. Unlike athletes, he wasn't receiving royalties on every pair sold. In his eyes, he was creating tremendous value for Nike while not fully sharing in the profits. It was a lesson that would completely change the next stage of his career. In 2013, Kanye made a bold move. He left Nike and signed a deal with Adidas. At the time, many people thought it was a strange decision. Adidas was struggling to compete with Nike in the United States, and Kanye's previous collaboration had become closely associated with Nike's image. But Adidas saw an opportunity. They believed Kanye wasn't just a celebrity. He was a cultural force capable of creating products people desperately wanted. More importantly, Adidas agreed to something Nike wouldn't. Kanye would receive royalties and significant creative control. He wasn't simply endorsing a product anymore. He was becoming a business partner. The first Yeezy Boost sneakers launched in 2015, and demand exploded almost immediately. Stores couldn't keep them on shelves. Limited releases created enormous hype, with customers lining up for hours just for the chance to buy a pair. On the resale market, prices often doubled or tripled overnight. Scarcity became part of the strategy. Instead of flooding stores with inventory, Adidas released products in carefully controlled quantities. The harder the shoes were to get, the more desirable they became. Every drop felt like an event. Social media amplified the excitement. Celebrities wore the sneakers, and sneaker culture embraced Yeezy as one of the most exclusive brands in the world. But Yeezy wasn't just selling shoes. It was selling identity. The minimalist design stood out from traditional athletic footwear. Some people loved them, others hated them. But everyone had an opinion. That's exactly what great branding often does. It creates conversation. Soon, Yeezy expanded beyond sneakers into clothing, slides, foam runners, and lifestyle products. What had started as a celebrity collaboration evolved into one of Adidas' most valuable businesses. The numbers were staggering. Analysts estimated that Yeezy generated between $1 and $2 billion in annual sales for Adidas. Some reports suggested the Yeezy line accounted for a significant portion of Adidas' profits. Investors loved it. Customers loved it. The partnership seemed unstoppable. As Yeezy grew, so did Kanye's estimated net worth. Much of that wealth wasn't cash sitting in a bank account. Instead, it represented the estimated future value of his ownership rights, royalties, and the business itself. Financial publications calculated that the Adidas partnership was worth billions because it was expected to continue generating enormous profits for years to come. On paper, Kanye had become one of the richest entertainers in history, but every empire has vulnerabilities. In Kanye's case, the biggest weakness was that so much of his wealth depended on one company. Adidas manufactured the products. Adidas handled global distribution. Adidas managed retail relationships. Adidas operated the supply chain. While Kanye owned the Yeezy brand and creative vision, Adidas provided the infrastructure that turned those ideas into a worldwide business. As long as the partnership remained strong, everything worked. But if it ended, the value of the business could change dramatically. Then came 2022. Over several weeks, Kanye made a series of controversial public statements, including anti-Semitic remarks that sparked widespread condemnation. Public criticism intensified rapidly. Social media erupted. Fans, celebrities, and business leaders called for companies to distance themselves. One after another, major partners began cutting ties. Balenciaga ended its relationship. Gap announced the termination of its Yeezy partnership. Talent agency CAA stopped representing him. Other projects quietly disappeared. The biggest question remained unanswered. What would Adidas do? At first, Adidas faced enormous pressure from both sides. On one hand, Yeezy was one of its most profitable product lines. Walking away meant sacrificing billions in future revenue. On the other hand, continuing the partnership risked severe damage to the company's reputation. Consumers, investors, employees, and advocacy groups were watching closely. Every day, Adidas delayed making a decision increased criticism. Eventually, the company concluded that the reputational risk outweighed the financial reward. In October 2022, Adidas officially announced it was ending its partnership with Kanye West. The company stated that his recent comments and behavior were unacceptable and inconsistent with its values. It also warned investors that ending the partnership would have a significant financial impact on Adidas itself. That announcement demonstrated just how valuable Yeezy had become. Even Adidas expected to lose hundreds of millions of dollars because of the decision. But the financial impact on Kanye was even greater. Almost immediately after Adidas announced the split, Forbes revised its estimate of Kanye's net worth. The publication concluded that without the Adidas partnership, he was no longer a billionaire. His estimated fortune dropped from roughly $2 billion to around $400 million. Headlines around the world claimed Kanye had lost over $1.5 billion overnight. Those headlines were technically simplified, but they captured an important truth. Kanye hadn't lost billions in physical cash. Instead, he lost the estimated value of an asset that no longer existed in the same form. Imagine owning half of a company valued at $2 billion. If the company suddenly collapses, your wealth disappears on paper, even though nobody physically removed money from your wallet. That's essentially what happened here. Much of Kanye's fortune depended on future earnings from Adidas and the market's confidence that Yeezy would continue growing for years. Once that partnership ended, those future earnings became uncertain, dramatically reducing the estimated value of his business. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about billionaire wealth. When people hear that someone is worth $2 billion, they often imagine giant bank accounts filled with cash. In reality, most billionaires own assets. Their wealth comes from shares in companies, ownership stakes, intellectual property, real estate, and future business expectations. Those values can rise or fall very quickly. In Kanye's case, a large percentage of his estimated fortune was tied directly to Adidas' ability to manufacture and sell Yeezy products on a global scale. The split also created practical problems. Without Adidas, Kanye no longer had access to one of the world's largest manufacturing and distribution networks. Designing shoes is one challenge. Producing millions of pairs, managing factories, shipping worldwide, and placing products in stores across dozens of countries is an entirely different business. Adidas had spent decades building that infrastructure. Replacing it wouldn't happen overnight. Following the split, Adidas was left with massive amounts of unsold Yeezy inventory. The company eventually decided to sell portions of that inventory, while donating part of the proceeds to organizations combating anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. Adidas also spent years dealing with the financial consequences of ending the partnership. Even after the relationship ended, Yeezy continued affecting the company's financial results. Meanwhile, Kanye attempted to rebuild independently. He announced plans to sell products directly to consumers through his own website, cutting out traditional retailers. He also explored new business ideas and continued speaking publicly about creating an independent fashion empire. While some releases generated attention, rebuilding a global brand without Adidas proved far more difficult than launching one with the support of an international corporation. Manufacturing challenges, distribution limitations, and ongoing controversy made sustained growth significantly harder. Despite everything that happened, the Yeezy brand itself still demonstrated remarkable recognition. Millions of people around the world continued associating the name with innovative sneaker design. That raises an interesting question. How much of Yeezy's success came from Kanye's creativity? And how much came from Adidas manufacturing, logistics, and global reach? The answer is probably both. One side created demand. The other made it possible to satisfy that demand at scale. Together, they built something extraordinary. Separately, both faced enormous challenges. This story isn't simply about controversy or celebrity headlines. It's about business structure. One partnership transformed Kanye from a successful musician into one of the wealthiest entertainers in history. The exact same partnership also became the greatest vulnerability in his financial empire. When the relationship ended, much of the value disappeared with it. There are important lessons here for entrepreneurs, investors, and anyone building a business. First, ownership matters. Kanye became incredibly wealthy because he negotiated royalties and ownership rather than settling for a traditional endorsement deal. That's the same principle that helped celebrities like 50 Cent, Ryan Reynolds, and George Clooney build fortunes beyond their primary careers. But there's another lesson that's just as important. Diversification matters. When too much of your wealth depends on a single company, customer, or partnership, your financial future becomes vulnerable to events you may not fully control. Imagine building a business where 90% of your income comes from one client. Everything looks great while the relationship lasts. But if that client leaves, the business suddenly faces enormous pressure. The larger the dependency, the greater the risk. Kanye's empire illustrates that principle on one of the biggest stages imaginable. In the end, Kanye West didn't become a billionaire through music alone. He became a billionaire by understanding the value of ownership. But he also showed the danger of concentrating so much of that wealth in one partnership. His rise with Adidas remains one of the greatest celebrity business success stories ever created. His fall after the partnership ended remains one of the fastest wealth declines in entertainment history. The next time you hear that someone is worth billions of dollars, remember this story. Net worth isn't always cash. Sometimes it's confidence. Sometimes it's future expectations. And sometimes it's one business relationship holding an entire empire together. When that relationship disappears, the fortune can disappear with it.